Hello and welcome to this section which deals with the distinction between expressions and statements. Expressions are units of code that return a value. Statements are units of code that do not return a value. Expressions can be chained together, statements cannot. And Scala very consciously favors expressions over statements. By this, I mean that a whole bunch of common language constructs that are expressions in Scala are statements in other languages like Java. Going back to the idea that our language shapes our thoughts, this distinction between expressions and statements, so subtly created in Scala, quite profoundly changes the structure of code that we write in Scala and makes it very different from code that we write in Java. We'll come back to that, but for now, let's take a look at some examples of expressions and statements. Expressions are ubiquitous, they are everywhere. Even a literal, like the string hello world, is an expression. Anything that evaluates to a value is an expression. An object, such as a collection, is an expression as well. What you see on screen now is a list containing within it a whole bunch of objects. String objects, in fact. But if we now took that same expression, which created a list, and if we assigned it to a data item, a value, what we get is a statement. And the statement that you see on screen now clearly does not return anything. Statements are less common in Scala than in other languages, but they are still required for operations such as initializing variables, printing to screen, or writing to files. As far as possible, though, avoid statements and use expressions instead. Expressions can be R values, they can sit on the right hand side of an assignment operator, and that's one of their most interesting characteristics. Expressions can also be used to specify function arguments, and by chaining together expressions one inside another, you can get a lot done with a very small amount of code. This one cryptic fragment that you see on screen now takes a function object, it applies that function object to every element of a list that's called weekdays. It gets as a result yet another list, and it then prints out to screen the contents of that list. Don't worry if what's on screen doesn't make sense, we'll cover all of this in detail, but I present it here as an example of how cryptic Scala code is, and to a large extent that's because of the power of composing expressions. An expression need not only consist of one bit of code on one line, you can have multiple statements or expressions enclosed within curly braces, and these together constitute something known as an expression block. The last expression in an expression block serves as the return value of that expression block. Expression blocks are really very powerful and they are closely linked to functions. Expression blocks can be nested. It's perfectly possible to have one expression block with multiple scopes within it. Here on screen now is an example of an expression block with a nested expression block inside. Both the outer and the inner scopes define the constant pi. The outer scope defines it as 3.1, the inner scope defines it as 3.14. The return value uses the value from the outer scope, that is 3.1. And the return value of this entire expression block is the last expression which makes use of the outer value of pi, that's 3.1.